Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 2015 Sebald Lecture in Literary Translation. My name is Duncan Large, and I'm the Academic Director of the British Centre for Literary Translation. The BCLT sponsors this annual flagship event, which began as the St. Jerome Lecture and was then renamed after his untimely death in 2001 in honour of acclaimed writer and critic W.G. Max Sebald. Sebald was based for over 30 years at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, where he latterly held the post of Professor of European Literature. In 1989, he founded the BCLT there as a place of residence to host visiting literary translators and as an institution dedicated to promoting and celebrating the art of literary translation. Over this last year, then, the BCLT has been celebrating its 25th anniversary, and you should have found on your seat a complimentary copy of My BCLT, which is launched this evening and gathers together a quarter century of personal takes on the BCLT, its history and achievements. That volume gives a flavour of how the BCLT has changed over the years, and this spring we're about to change again as we begin an exciting new partnership with the National Centre for Writing in Norwich. For the Sebald Lecture each year, we invite a leading cultural figure to reflect on the art of literary translation from their personal perspective. It's my great pleasure and honour this evening to introduce to you as Sebald Lecturer 2015, the writer A.L. Kennedy. Alison Kennedy's first book, the award-winning short story collection Night Geometry and the Garskadden Trains, was published in 1990, only a few months after the founding of the BCLT. Her first novel, the Somerset Maugham award-winning Looking for the Possible Dance, followed in 1993. And that year, she was promptly included among Granta's Best of Young British Novelists, a distinction that would be repeated a decade later. In the course of her career, Alison has won a great many other awards and accolades, including the Costa Book of the Year Award in 2007 for her novel Day. She's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and of the Royal Society of Literature and teaches creative writing at her alma mater, the University of Warwick. By now, Alison is the author of, I think, 17 books, 6 novels, 7 short story collections and 4 works of non-fiction. Her most recent story collection, All the Rage, was published by Jonathan Cape in spring last year, and we are grateful to her for taking time out this evening from her work completing her next novel. She's perhaps best known as a novelist and short story writer, but she's also one of our most versatile writing talents. Having studied English and drama, she's also written radio and stage plays, as well as scripts for film and TV. She is a consummate performer and likes to take her work to the public more directly, most notably as a stand-up comedian and with her one-person touring show Words. A version of the latter is included in her non-fiction collection On Writing, the major part of which began life as a popular series of blogs for The Guardian. Alison is also a frequent broadcaster on cultural and political topics. One of the many awards A.L. Kennedy has received was the Austrian State Prize for European Literature in 2007. This stands as a testament to the extent of her appreciation outside the English-speaking world, for her works have been frequently translated into German and other languages, an experience on which she'll be drawing in this evening's lecture. Her work has deep roots in her native Scotland, but at the same time is steeped in international traditions of writing, and she's a ready champion both of translated literature and of language learning. This evening, we are privileged to hear from her, and her title is The Language of the Heart. Ladies and gentlemen, A.L. Kennedy.
Thank you, good evening. These occasions, it's always very nice to be introduced so pleasantly. It also feels slightly as if one has died, attending one's own funeral. So yes, I would thank everybody concerned for allowing me to give the Sebald lecture this year, and I did look back at the roll call of impressive previous speakers, and I can only feel honoured to be here, and also wonder if this is all a terrible mistake. When I considered Sebald, I was both worried and reassured. Sebald was a respected man of letters in what I might call the European sense. Sebald, an international intellectual. Sebald, the German. Sebald, the man who could not forget the Holocaust. Sebald, the voluntary exile. Sebald, the not English man living in England. Sebald, the man I once saw at a conference and found too imposing a figure even to approach. True. But this was also Sebald, the man whose mind I can enter, whose voice I can hear in my head translated into words and out from words. Sebald, whose observations, whose thinking can please me as beauty does, whose despair can give me company in my own and therefore be, in fact, a kind of hope. His work says, as in a way all good authors do, here is my anguish, but hear and feel and know how it becomes this music which can enter your thinking, enter your breathing, your lungs rising and falling with the breath of another, with the breath of multiple others. A man walking in Suffolk, a teacher who was once a soldier, a man whose family has been destroyed, the ghosts and fragile, strange decisions of that family. W.G. Sebald was a writer and therefore my friend. Not only because I am a smaller writer, but still a writer, but also because I am a reader and because I am a human being. Sebald, a man acutely aware of how badly wrong cultures can go, was himself part of how right cultures can go, what riches they can contain, and what safeguards. His is a large name for me to live up to. I was relieved to notice one reference to him on the internet, the source of all truth and none at all. The reference was tagged with the 3 keywords: depression, emptiness, German. Yeah, I can tick 2 of those boxes. In this lecture, I would like to look a little at the practical reality for an author of having work translated, of the language of one heart passing to another. And although I do believe in the horror of human nature and the terrible capacity of the human imagination to produce destruction, I do believe that our imaginations can also save us, that our emptiness can become positive, a space for light to enter in, for a need that reaches out to others in humility, a need to speak, a need to create. I also believe that obviously depression can be a sane response to an insane world, but then also something we move beyond, something we banish with imagination and with multiple acts of translation, small and large. And this won't be a lecture which needs, I hope, the keywords depression, emptiness, Scottish. I hope it will clearly be a statement about an activity which has brought me great joy, writing, and which is part of greater joys, the joy of defending humanity, exploring and preserving what it is to be human, the joy of making something out of nothing and giving it to strangers, the joy of dreaming and making those dreams take a shape comprehensible to others, the joy of being translated, joy at a level of transcendence that St. Jerome might have understood. I can't guarantee that. He seemed to have very fixed ideas about what and wasn't proper in women's behaviour. I probably wouldn't have been ascetic enough for him. And he loved a good tussle over doctrine, had very firm opinions on what was and wasn't a sound way to view this world and the world he envisaged beyond it. St. Jerome, a much-travelled translator, a man who explored extremities, who moved between both luxury and tombs, uncanny darkness and relieving light. I mention him because, as has been mentioned, the lectures used to bear his name, which I find interesting. If you're a translator, he's your patron saint, and of librarians and encyclopedists. And if he does still take an interest, he would find Britain today, I feel, a rather disheartening place. But back to translation. When we work in any art, in my case in writing, this involves a series of translations, some undertaken inadvertently or instinctively, and some undertaken with a sense of purpose. Our aim, I hope, is to move from one heart to another while retaining as much truth as possible, balancing individuality, which is convincing, on a number of levels, a sense of personality and characters, and in the author's narrative voice and presence, in settings and choice of time and place, balancing that specificity with a need for accessibility to other individuals in other times, other places. Human beings about whom the artist, in this case the author, knows nothing. Rather than allowing this to make us bland or to compromise, in fact, the need to be translated, even if we remain in our own language, drives us into a type of deep simplicity. We push further and further into a more and more fundamental understanding of human nature and press ourselves to make plain what we find. And in this we find our best hope for universality. And this is something that half-formed art, unfinished art, the shadowy imitations of art, the use of art as propaganda does not understand. This is why in the long run that kind of art doesn't last well. Sadly, it can also encourage the destruction of the art that could last, of the art which can lend human beings an access to the edge of immortality. The acts of barbarism and vandalism, which lawyer and campaigner Raphael Lemkin identified as precursors of genocide. Lemkin, I can't even summarize how many languages he could speak. We first destroy in effigy and then in reality. We first destroy the beauty which others can make, that which makes them seem miraculous, which brings their breathing close. We first destroy those artifacts which give them both specificity and universality. We take away the power that art can wield to celebrate, to please, and to defend them. Then we destroy them, those human beings, when it is easy to do so. The translation of imagination into artifact is, I feel, often undervalued, particularly in the UK at the edge of the 21st century. The activity of imagination, working as it does to produce alternatives to reality, is of huge importance when we consider our political and moral futures as a group, and when we consider the translation of one mind into the open representation of another fictional mind, one which does not exist in reality and therefore is free to be inhabited in depth by a reader, which has been built with that intention to receive, having been inhabited in depth by an author, that has huge implications for our political and moral futures as individuals. The constant action of art as a medium to give us ways of seeing which are not or not yet our own, ways of being which are not or not yet our own, is hugely important in our relationships with others and our understanding of others. You'll be familiar with the saying that if you want to understand a man, a person other than yourself, then you should walk a mile in that individual's shoes. Writing can give us a very specific and detailed way of putting on those shoes, as can art in general when it is functioning effectively. The obverse would be represented by the almost equally old joke: if you want to understand a man, walk a mile in his shoes, then you'll be a mile away from him and you'll have his shoes. Poorly made art, unfinished art, slapdash or malign art, dark art, it steals from those it touches and distances us from humanity. It divides the world into thieves with ill-fitting shoes and barefoot victims, and sets an uncrossable distance between them. When any culture is filled with what I would call cheap and nasty replacements for art, reality TV, ghost-written misery memoirs, boil-in-the-bag reproductions of previous successes, vehicles for thuggish propaganda, loveless sex, degraded intimacy, celebrity promotions with minimal human content, exploitations with little or no regard for their audience, vehicles for hate. This isn't simply unpleasant and boring. It's dangerous. This produces a sick culture, a vessel for the kind of hair-trigger anxiety, despair and isolation which makes consumers and voters both destructive and self-destructive and increasingly vulnerable to further manipulation. We may not like to think we are affected by our environments, but we are every day, almost every moment, translated from one state to another by our surroundings. And part of those surroundings are built from our art, from our words. And this places a clear burden upon any writer, any artist, to make prudent use of their influence in a wider cultural setting. If we forget our place in the world, or never seek to define it, our cultures have a tendency to travel along a gradient of lowering effort and lowering cost. When our culture doesn't remind us of who we are, let us share breaths, bodies, lives, then we're apart, either predators or victims, with no other options shown to be available. The next steps we take can be fatal. Sebald was aware of how fatal, and Germany, rich in contact with other cultures before World War II, and then slowly poisoned by dark art, its flaws and fears magnified, Germany still fights to retain a powerful sense of how precious culture is and the massively important purpose that it serves. And this is not to say that art must preach or be bent to the service of parties or interests, or restrained in some kind of dutiful, politically correct mumbling about goodness and comfort. If art is functioning at full tilt, pursuing its nature, opening us to each other, displaying lives with understanding, making other worlds possible, believable, inhabitable, then it is simply being itself, fully and effectively, with no agenda. But that is enough to save us, in as far as we can be saved. Poor, frail, dying creatures that we are, in the light of which we deserve beauty all the more. I note here briefly how much UK publishing in its vigorous heyday owed to immigrants and the children of immigrants. Victor Gollancz, who published, among others, Ford Madox Ford or Ford Hermann Hofer. George Weidenfeld, who published, among others, Nabokov. Frederick Warburg, Martin Secker, born Percy Martin Secker Klingenden, who published, among others, Günter Grass and Alberto Moravia. William Heinemann. We're used to these names. These seem familiar, these actually very European names, often German names. But they brought with them a passion for culture. Often the culture they saw being evaporated in the 1930s and 1940s in Europe and beyond. UK publishers once had a commitment to literature, a vivid understanding of disastrous cultural manipulation and destruction, of the dangers inherent in weak literatures, of forgetting our inheritance of thought. I would argue that this passion has either faded or been constrained in this country of multimedia mega corporations and the bottom line. In this country where 3%, less than 3% of books published annually will be translated from any language. In this country of self-fulfilling prophecies, this inward-looking island that shouts at its neighbours and worries when it hears people speaking foreign languages on trains. This country that does not listen well and does not read widely, but has to fight to even make the attempt. Now, I'm not a translator, although I know that there are very likely, many of you are translators in the audience. Certainly people who know far more about translation than I do, or most likely ever will. I do understand how deeply indebted I am to my own translators for allowing my work to live in countries and languages beyond Britain. I don't say countries and languages beyond my own because clearly I have problems with the UK's culture. Parts of it are in an alarming condition. And as an author, although I understand the need for specificity and its paradoxical production of universality, I am nervous of being labelled as a British author or a Scottish author, because this so often leads to sterile discussions about national characteristics and canons. What has always interested me as a reader and an author has been the universal access afforded by literature. To walk down Nevsky Prospect, with Gogol before I walked there myself. To be in despair and in London with Robert Louis Stevenson. I've visited both despair and London. To long for Moscow with Chekhov and then go there and never be quite allowed to reach 6 Sadovaya Kudrinskaya Street in Presnensky and see his house. We went to the place where he got his flowers for Yalta, apparently. To weep over João Baldo Ribeiro's terrible, terrible sergeant and Sergeant Getulio, and over Ribeiro's wonderful, wonderful, invincible memory, built of our memories, of our words and dreams, and given to me through the medium of Brazil, a country I have never visited. I'll begin by addressing my debt to translation and translators. First of all, the people who gave me Gogol and Chekhov and Calvino and Ribeiro and Mann and Gras and Hrabal and Krasnohorkai and Parucho and Alfao and Marquez and so many other massive translations in all senses. The ones I became addicted to when I was a student, when there were those white-spined picador books that would take me anywhere, and so many other open doors and possibilities, and it could be hoped that we would do better and learn more, and remember that translations might sell, even if they didn't involve murders or a TV tie-in. My own work has been translated to a number of other languages, among them French, German, Estonian, Greek, Armenian, Hungarian, some languages with which I'm passingly familiar or in which I might be able to buy a railway ticket, languages which are recorded using alphabets I managed to decode, and those which utilize symbols entirely beyond me. It's a privilege to have my words go so far and be so changed, while also remaining in many respects the same. And of course, being translated means that my income can increase without my workload having to increase at all. Such a circumstance would be remarkable and helpful for most people, and is particularly remarkable and helpful for any writer. I'm not alone amongst British writers in being increasingly supported by income from sales of German translations, although I'm a writer living in the UK and writing in English. The openness to translated work of Germany in particular stands in depressing contrast to the UK's current impermeability. It's fatal to be a writer locked out of even a good translation of someone as prominent as Geza Chat, to know so little of how the rest of the world is moving, to hear only distant voices from Africa or the Middle East, or expatriate voices, to arrive in countries as a visitor and not be able to name one living author you have read from that whole nation. It's shameful. And my loss, my nation's loss, the thinking portion of my nation's loss. And it's embarrassing to be supported so wholeheartedly by countries I know my local literature does not support in return. It can also seem slightly distasteful to mention income when one talks about something, in this case writing, which is a vocation, which affects the heart, which provides joy and fulfillment, something which is an art. But obviously, if the artist cannot support him or herself through the practice of their art and has no other means of support, then they have to make alternative financial arrangements. And that means they have less time to practice their vocation, less time to produce artifacts that are hopefully of use to others and a source of satisfaction to themselves. Artifacts that enrich their surrounding culture. Time and money are connected. We can't ignore this. It is probably healthy to agree that money cannot ever genuinely buy art. It is too important to be bought. But we need to be realistic about money's role in procuring time to work and expertise to apply within that work. I mention this partly because I'm a resident of a country where everything, from learning to health to the incarceration of wrongdoers, is increasingly evaluated in solely financial terms. This, of course, makes it increasingly hard to justify arts activity in this country, or indeed the provision of opportunities for learning or healthcare or functional and socially sustainable methods of incarceration. And, of course, the arts are part of how we might express dismay at this state of affairs, and how we might also express why human beings could or even should deserve better and generally be defended from harm. And it has to be said, Artists and writers become part of this problem when they have to break off from their work or compromise because they have to look after their loved ones, pay their bills, ensure their children are educated and healthy and not incarcerated. It's sometimes hard to remember that writers who live in countries with very little censorship or restraint need to work all the more passionately to preserve our communal well-being, and one would like to hope in order to push tiny transformations towards those who are less fortunate and less free. Democracy, or an illusion of democracy, can make us lazy. Financial strain can make us selfish. This can mean we end in silence and bad work just as surely as those who are under threat, or those who are threatened with hardships and pains if they don't write as they are told to. Returning specifically to translation, having my work translated means that I will quite often be asked to travel abroad at others' expense in order to promote that work. And while I do so, I will very often be looked after kindly. My words in my absence can make links to readers in cultures with which I am perhaps not at all familiar, and those readers' responses to my work, coming as they do from new and sometimes challenging or surprising perspectives, can be particularly informative and moving. And all these effects of translation are lovely things, precisely the kind of things I might have imagined for myself if I had ever anticipated being a published author, if my imagination had ever hoped so wildly, so ambitiously, to go so far and be so changed while remaining in some respects the same. But these lovely things are not important things about being translated. My being indulged is no more essential to my art than money, and can have just as malign an influence. And I would rather talk here about key moments of translation. Firstly, moments when the process of having my work translated has also translated me, when I have been moved to a place of greater understanding and changed in a way that has allowed me to become more fully myself. I do think that one of the effects one might hope for when practicing an art would be that one becomes more fully oneself. Not because one is especially wonderful, but simply because in an individual it is an individual's only option in the real world. And having only one life, one would wish to make the most of it. The first translator I ever talked to with any seriousness, more than 20 years ago, was Ingo Herzke. At that time, one of a group of German students who had arranged a small tour of universities there for me before I was really known or translated in Germany. Ingo attended my readings then and heard my voice, reading my voice, as it were, having read my work in English. And we also had enough time to discuss my aim to keep music, the sense of physical voice and the body that produces it, at the heart of my writing. We talked and we shared enthusiasm, and we liked each other. We got on. This was a point early in my career when I was able to clarify a truth which might have been lost if I hadn't had the opportunity to explore it with someone else. Ingo has a great ear. Two, in fact. He's a highly intelligent reader, and he has a sense of the dignity of his profession. He's very clear that translation isn't just transcription, that it cannot ever be successful if it involves a loss of beauty. He helped me realize that a true, if we can use that word, translator is both a writer and a reader. As an idea comes to me to be expressed, and I must be the medium for it, so Ingo receives my rendering of that idea, which I thought important enough to impose upon others, and he expresses it. We both pass on, hopefully, meaning and emotion in the language of our hearts with some kind of commitment from those hearts. And perhaps authors who can feel themselves the source of material can become overly fond of themselves and their importance, and perhaps translators who can feel themselves simply the servants of something pre-existing, or certainly can be treated as if they are. Perhaps they can dismiss themselves as not overly important. I love that Ingo doesn't dismiss himself, and that we can work together in a way that's very close with regard to text, and yet actually very independent when you consider us as people. In comparison to other translators, he always gives me the lowest number of queries because he's taken the time to understand me, my voice, and the specific piece he's been given to work on. He applies himself practically to make the pieces as much of themselves as they can be, just as I hope I do, just as I hope any translator or indeed editor would. We all serve the thing itself, the words, and seek to define the best way to realize the idea and the words that hold it, using the terms the piece provides as it grows and matures and becomes more clearly defined. This is the virtuous cycle towards which we aim, a dynamic and exciting process outside rigid guidelines. And it's unsurprising, and I think important to note, that Ingo can read aloud from my work, from the work of any of his authors, can add his voice to theirs with precisely appropriate levels of clarity and emotion. And here we have to remember that reading aloud is not the same as acting. It's more an energetic setting forth of words which are designed to speak for themselves on the page, with only the minimum of added heat from the reader's attention. It's been my pleasure to have Ingo as my Deutsche Stimme, my German voice, for prose, drama and journalism, all my German work. But when we met for those few initial days, we only knew that we felt the meaning of language was naturally hugely important, but also understood what I would hope any text would acknowledge and exploit, the fact that part of its meaning is carried in melody, rhythm, syncopation, silence. Neurologically speaking, even reading inwardly to ourselves contains much which is concerned with live sound. And sometimes the musical imperative may mean that my language is pressed into unconventional forms so that the whole can be as it should, hopefully coherent and effective. My discussions with Ingo clarified this for the first time, and it scared me to realize this was true, but here it was, the truth. For a few months thereafter, I felt as if a metallic kind of shadow was hovering over me. I had a perception that I had chosen to take a terrible risk and possibly even to act irrationally as I wrote, when I am at heart a docile, violently and Calvinistically educated Scot, and was always taught that there should be a pattern to follow, one size fits all for any activity. I was brought up believing that complex rules and theories would keep me safe. If only I could fence myself in with them firmly enough, I'd be able to relax. An artist limiting themselves, clinging to theories, not responding dynamically to their own work, that's an artist fighting their work. It takes a while to discover that, especially as arts activity is increasingly commodified. And if you're being sold training in, say, creative writing, then you might feel shortchanged if you don't get a whole bucket of regulations and theories that will ensure success. And you might be taught within an academic establishment used to producing research, theories and guidelines, and unable to offer writers what they need, which is opportunities to learn from their own experience and that of others, self-knowledge, understanding of voice, and the insight that will allow them to tear up whatever parts of the rule book do not apply. With Ingo, I'd been one human being talking to another, initially a stranger who owed me nothing, but who chose to listen to me because my work had provided an introduction. And it seemed clear that simple, flexible methodologies, craft skills, organically developed philosophies were key to advancing in my craft and art. Any rules, any imperatives would be built around what seems to be the human necessity to speak, to be compelled by matters of urgent relevance and urgent beauty into expression and the creation of further beauty for strangers. The pressing ideas which introduce themselves to us and which introduce a deep part of who we are and what we care for to the mind of another, to many minds one at a time, as an intimate gift, an intimate act. These ideas can't be governed by academic or literary concerns, by critical theory or political or social theories. We can react to them or be informed by them, but our speech, our right to that speech, that is a free thing, and its only obligation is to be comprehensible, beautiful, and according to its own logic and nature, true. This lack of regulation offers us the work of a lifetime, an endless progress and process of realization. It also perhaps helps to make clear the moral obligations of the artist to their wider context and their individual readers and themselves, because it makes clear the fact that the expression of heartfelt importance can drive our continuing education. It can help us grow as artists as nothing else will. It also prevents us clogging up other human beings' limited lifespans with, hopefully, substandard work, and allows us to contribute to the cultural climate of our own and other countries. Ingo and I spoke about this, and for the first time, really because I am a solitary person and a solitary writer, I found that I was talking in detail about my work and doing so with certainty. My certainty surprised me, and I was speaking with what we might call a dispassionate passion. I was looking at what I had done as if it were not personal to me, and that allowed me to see rather more of its nature than I had before, and yet I was allowing myself to care about it, to care about advancing it as close to its ideal form as I could. I was finally beginning to operate within another one of writing's paradoxes, that of the dispassionately passionate writer, the author who is warmly devoted to the possibilities of a piece, but who will work on them without mercy. This allows us to serve whatever has come to us to be expressed. At the time, it allowed me to worry about my ability to serve my work adequately, and also excited about where my future might lie. Those worries and that excitement persist, and I am glad of both of them. And Ingo is my translator with a kind of organic success. I will say that if I hear Ingo read me, and I've sat on stage with him dozens of times, or if I hear someone else read Ingo's translations, I find the music I intended held there intact. He genuinely has produced my German voice. When my German wasn't wonderful, it's not great now, I could still recognize which passage was being read by its melody. And incidentally, hearing your own prose being read over and over in another language is a very good way to begin learning that language. You are effectively listening to how you will sound when you speak. And I can't be grateful enough that anyone would be able to make one set of words both sing in very much the same way and say very much the same thing as another completely different set of words. That's a kind of miracle, in fact. But being around Ingo so near the start of my career, as I say, helped me to look at one of the key parts of my work, this need for a good tune, this balance between sense and presence. Beyond this, he highlighted my horrible love of double meanings. English is full of double meanings, at least double. And again, initially, quite without intending, I pursue them in my prose with a kind of obsession. And while US copy editors and some other translators will pepper me with questions about whether I meant to have such and such an ambiguity, when surely I should pick one meaning or another and stick with it, well, I want both meanings. As long as they don't render each other nonsensical, as long as they belong together, I am greedy for multiple meanings. If they're there to be used by writers, surely. And I know that layered meanings will impact, at least subconsciously, with the reader, whether they're puns or stacked resonances of words like heat, cold, depth. And that's what I intend. Ingo knew that, knows it still, and reproduces equivalent effects in a language notorious for adding word length without actually increasing the mass of the books by that much. Partly because he doubles meanings, he preserves layers, among other things, and partly because, as I often tell him, he skips the dull bits and makes me look good for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. And he bends conventional German in clever and poetic ways, and I thank him. One more moment of translation. This one has been repeated a few times, but the first was the most educational. There is always a day for you as a writer when the queries arrive from your translator. Once upon a time, these would be a few sheets of paper holding line and page references. Now they'll most likely be an email attachment or some kind of sophisticated interactive document with expanding comment boxes and so forth. The kind of thing which would be a good idea if the software ever quite performed as advertised. And sometimes these notes are simply requests for clarification or guidance, and one can feel that one is meeting a like mind. There would be a hope that this would happen often because someone chose to translate you because they somehow got your work. But obviously translators may be assigned by publishers in a fairly arbitrary way, and translators may want to earn a living rather than simply sticking preciously to work they really love, and I can't comment on that kind of decision and how it might affect them and their work. I will say that occasionally the queries I've received have made me feel that I haven't written as I should be. They have been overly critical, if not actually rude, which I find unhelpful, really. It's hard to trust someone to render you into another language when they have contempt for what you do. That feeling of having failed as an author may also come from the content of the questions. After all, if this or that phrase or passage could be so completely misunderstood, then either I should retire myself as incompetent or ask if I can have another translator, which always, in my experience, seems to prove impossible. Either I am a moron or my words are not in safe hands. Perhaps both. The translators who seem to have had the greatest difficulty with both phrases and passages also, this is hardly surprising, have trouble with individual words. For example, they will ask me what I mean by heat, or light, or to fly, or to run. There are questions about these very basic, simple words, rarely about very polysyllabic, elevated words. And here, in an area that can be immensely frustrating because what I mean by heat is heat, here I have also found immense enlightenment, because when I use a simple word with wide resonance, I always really do strenuously mean the translator should use that simple word, the equivalent of that most basic word. If I'm being simple, I mean to be simple. I want the word you used when you were a child, the one embedded in your heart, the one you laboriously learned the shape of, the first one you met, the deepest one, the one with the most echoes. So in French, forgive all of my translation, but we'd go to chaleur, because in chaleur we have enough of feu, but we're bigger than feu, and passion is there, but again we're bigger than passion, or ardeur, but come back to me for ardeur later, because I might want to put that where you might want the simplicity of feu, but I might want more because of the surrounding psychology. I want Wärme, not, for example, Heizung. I want Harara, probably not Ner. In trying to explain my aim to someone whose language I don't know well, I had to find the principle on which I was operating. If I'm using the commonplace word, the non-literary word, I'm aiming for depth of impact. I'm aiming, if we think in terms of the eye's movement when you read, I'm aiming for the word you fix on, not the one you jump over with your saccadic movement. I want the one you look full in the face. And of course, if I'm dealing with a translator who is also a writer, I probably don't need to have this conversation. Certainly this conversation is one that I would expect any writer to understand and that I need my translator to understand, and this is the level at which we operate in order to at least attempt to produce art, writing, which is of any quality, which translates us into somewhere and into someone new, and which then can translate others. And naturally the problem queries stem from working sometimes with translators who are not also writers, who are chosen by publishers and editors, who perhaps have financial constraints operating, or an imperfect understanding of translation, or who are in a culture which isn't geared towards translation and listening to strange voices in a positive way, like those of Germany or, say, of the Scandinavian nations. But here again, early in my career, being translated forced me to address my intentions with seriousness at a time when I hadn't really examined them fully, for fear that they would melt away, or that I didn't really have any intentions, or that I would confuse myself. This was one occasion when I found out something of the detail within the decision-making process which takes place as I write, and while I am, therefore, slightly preoccupied. If I say run, I want the speed of that, and the fluency of that, the liquid associations and the directness of that, and also the sense of running away. So that's what I choose. The more elevated language is great. I use that too. I have characters who use that. But the underpinning of my prose is in the words that I used to think didn't matter. the little ones, the easy ones. Those give the difference between moving a touch and moving in a bit and moving in a fraction and moving in by an inch and moving in a little. Only one of those will be the best solution to my problem of telling you what I mean. And seeing my work through others' eyes helped me to find that understanding. And as I mentioned, being translated led me to actually being translated into other places. Moscow, Nevsky Prospect, Peredelkino, Paris, San Francisco, New York, New Delhi, Cairo, Dublin. There were many moments in these travels which were transformative, translating. Time and again in the Eastern Bloc, I met with publishers and writers who had continued to both publish and write, even if it meant they might be imprisoned or killed. The idea that not writing would be dying in a real enough sense to mean an author would risk execution to keep on not dying, that was humbling. It was equally humbling to meet so many hundreds of people who could speak my language, read me in my original version, while I could barely ask them, can I have a cup of tea, please? I can no longer count the readings I have given in English to large and thoughtful polyglot audiences in venues, sometimes purpose-built only for literary events. And when I have thought whether the equivalent buildings were available in the UK, and whether the equivalent audiences would also be there, I have known that we are not only failing ourselves, but that the idea of our country and our language as wise and powerful and well-connected and influential simply isn't reliable. Brits abroad are often figures of fun, of pity, of contempt. British publishers can likewise be regarded with dismay. The big ignorant children who guard a vast market, apparently filled with other big ignorant children. The people who talk about money and sales but don't actually seem to understand either. The guardians of culture who are afraid to make the wrong move and who have in many cases simply stopped moving at all as a result. We are better than that. We have an increasingly militant community of readers and thinkers, but we may yet live to regret that we became militant and unashamed of those beauties we love slightly too late to save the libraries, to save the small bookshops, to save the publication of new voices, strange voices, the novellas, the poetry collections, the short story collections, the non-mainstream novels, the first novels, the future readers, future authors. And I was also able to observe how other cultures operate in a wider sense. In this country, for example, experiences encouraged me to be ashamed to say what I do for a living. In Ireland, my admission would be of happy interest to everyone. In Scotland, my profession is far less embarrassing than it was 20 years ago. In Germany, France, and India, describing myself as an author may well lead almost immediately to discussions beyond my intellectual capacity. In the US, shame will rise again, that or discussions of income, or an interest that is sharp, almost besieged, will spring up, a sense of sharing a fine but beleaguered secret. Just as the different worlds I inhabited in my mind's eye before I travelled prepared me to be different, so being in other real cultures has allowed me to be a little better at observing my own with dispassionate passion. The cliché of the much-travelled author who simply returns with exotic locations to act as a backdrop for the same old characters is certainly always something to consider. Some of those locations are tempting, amazing, and sometimes it can be possible to know enough about them, learn enough to make them real, or know enough about how strange they can seem to portray them usefully from outside. I would hope to take the example of Chekhov and Stevenson. Chekhov travelled thoughtfully, provided a library for the incarcerated, and wrote as he found with understanding and a doctor's observation. Stevenson travelled immersively, went native, as it might have been put, to such an extent that his portrayals of the British Empire and its representatives abroad were censored at home. And in Samoa, he did good. He helped his community. He was a human being among human beings and understood himself to be such. I will mention in passing One moment of French translation. Perhaps it will be of interest to you professional translators. My second novel involved Cyrano de Bergerac coming back from the dead and having one more year of life. I thought that was fair. He died young, only 36, and was, it seems, a man passionate in his living, so an extra year in fantasy for the author of fantasy novels, the world's first 2 science fiction novels, seemed to be something someone should provide, and if it had to be me, then I would do my best. And this was a hard process. I had to go back to my rusty French, and then I had to go further back to French of the 17th century, and the musical, physical, unconventional French of Hercule Savignon. Now this seems logical, then it seemed terrifying. I spent many months reading and studying and worrying and shouting in what was then a small 2-room flat in Glasgow and wondering how I would afford to go to France and what I would find. What did I find? Everything. More than I could hold. In the mornings I would read in the old building, the old Bibliothèque Nationale, in a 17th century room, having been admitted in 17th century style with a lettre de créance from an ambassador. And I was touching, not even wearing gloves, touching handwritten manuscripts, this is marvellous but criminal, touching paper that he had touched, looking at the long, bold swipes of his pen when he crossed a T, looking at where he broke off writing and then started again. That man had stamina. And I'm breathing with his breath. I'm exclaiming as he does when he sees and makes me see that remarkable, luminous, explosive blue of violet. It's translation. And in the afternoons, I just wander about and by consistent accident find more about his life and more addresses he visited and places he would have seen, as if he is holding my hand and walking me along. It's my second novel I'm writing. I had the idea early enough for it to have been my first, but I left it until I might be able to manage to do the idea justice. And it's the first time I've travelled abroad since I was a child, and I feel at home, as I don't always feel at home in British cities. I love Paris. I love Paris with a double heart, his and mine. And I try to then write about it with the language of my heart, and I sit in another reading room with printed books of Cyrano's, scribbled over in pencil by academics who don't like his prose style. And I am angry on his behalf. But I am also so happy for him. He has outlasted all his critics. His place at the edge of immortality is secure. There he is, my dear friend whom I have never met. Is that what it's like to translate? I do hope so. Or is it perhaps more a matter of the body even than this? I am familiar with one more aspect of translation, the translation of my words into the body of another who is certainly a reader but also an actor. There is something remarkable and educational about being read by an actor. I will say that this means something especially to me because I first fell in love consciously with words, having been a voracious and early reader, because I saw actors making them sing more than I could in my head. I saw actors being, I might say, the reverse of reducing, robbing art, being extraordinary in an accessible way. We watch a good production of Hamlet. We don't say, princes are great, or I am not a prince and therefore I am not great, or I am not Danish, not a man, not a student, not all the things that Hamlet is. We become Hamlet. And we remember that we can be great. We see a human being who has learned how to be a human being in a very expressive way and to reveal a great deal about their interior with great beauty and clarity, and we realize what a magical creature we might be, what magical creatures we might all be. And I could narrate you through the first time I ever saw real actors walk on a real stage and felt the world kick under me and move just a little to another place. Or I could tell you about the time I sat and talked about a production of King Lear with someone else who had seen it. Both of us recalling events from 20 years before as an auditorium in Stockholm filled up behind us, and we talked and talked and were transported to another auditorium and another joy, and when we turned round, an entire audience had appeared to watch something else entirely that involved us. And I, for one, felt inadequate, and yet also delighted to be a small part of the same thing, the practice of art, the same remarkable, beneficent, merciful, generous cloth that can cover and warm us all. But I will, in fact, tell you about the work of another German, Alfred Wolfson, a veteran of the First World War, a young man interested in voice and singing, but supposed to be preparing for a career in law. His studies were interrupted by horror. He fought for Germany, and in the midst of slaughter, he was both haunted and inspired by the cries of the dying. He noticed that those crying, screaming for their lives, produce voices that are fully expressed, complete, of course. But he was aware that in life, very few people express themselves in their voices fully. And so when he came home, he devoted the rest of his life to helping human beings develop their voices. A Jew, he was forced to flee Germany by the Nazis and came to live in London. He had been revolted not only by the content, of course, of Nazi propaganda, but by the falsity and ugliness of their voices. And he resisted that. As part of my work to develop as a writer and as a speaker and as a human being, I've studied Wolfson's methodology, and I can recommend it to anyone. A writer who can't speak fully, can't breathe fully, can't read their work out loud in the air with some kind of comfort, that's perhaps a more limited writer than they need to be. Marks on paper are all well and good, but language is much more than that. Language is in decrees, promises, prayers, declarations of love, of war, hate, in cries for our life, in exclamations at the beauty of violence. From heart to heart they go, healing and harming and harming and healing. The more of their energy we can take to ourselves, the more we have access to healing and access to our possibilities of translation. The last moment I'll describe is one that's very much to do with voice and the realization of voice. I've written a number of plays, and sometimes they're well directed and produced, and sometimes not, and sometimes the casts are great, and sometimes slightly less happy. I've been lucky with casts mainly, but even so, the translation I will describe has happened very rarely. I'm talking about the moment when someone takes my words and, while being themselves, also inhabits those words to such an extent that their nature becomes very clear. And this has an effect which is emotionally pleasing and also intellectually satisfying, but that's not all. When everything works exactly as it should, a kind of resonance is set up so that someone speaking my words, breathing when I breathed, actually does reflect my own breath back to me. They literally catch my breath. It's a strange thing to sit and watch someone doing something you've studied and pored over for hours, something that you know deeply and well, and yet it surprises you. It inhabits you as it only could with the help of someone else. You are echoing each other in a way which evokes a remarkable stillness. The moment when you realize you have gone so far, so much further than you'd thought, and been so changed. And this person is not wearing your shoes, but wearing your mind, your skin, your intentions, and you theirs. And yet, they are the same as they ever were, only more so, and you are the same as you ever were, only more so. It is beautiful. And this is not an academic moment, a financial moment, an ego-driven moment, a selfish moment. It's a simple impossibility that has been created. Two people or one person for the span of these breaths. An idea has been translated into fact. The world is a little different, perhaps only for this moment, perhaps forever. To have one moment such as this is almost all I would have asked for from my writing. To aim to create similar moments of unity and individuality, of depth and fully realized living, that is not only a joy, but a responsibility. Every word we write must add to the consolation and defense of humanity. There really isn't any time for anything else, and anything else will not be good enough. If we aspire to this, I truly believe we will be translated in every sense that is true and beneficial, beautiful and joyful. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you for a wonderfully generous and inspiring Sebald lecture. We do have time for questions. We have about 20 minutes or so, and so Alison has kindly agreed to take questions from the audience. And at this point, I'd like to open up to audience questions. If I could ask those who ask questions to wait until they receive the microphone, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I do read quite a lot in translation, but I've noticed in recent years a real problem with translations being published here but in America, and even people like Faber's, who used to be a good publisher, are now putting it into American. Now, you know, people in the middle of China who are supposed to be Chinese suddenly come out with American vocabulary. It's just impossible to read. Could you just pick this up and comment, please?
No, it's awful. Or even Enigma, which has very good acting in it, but is a bizarrely inaccurate script, almost from end to end. I mean, it's not the right Enigma machine. It's not the right machine that answered the Enigma machine. It actually accuses him of the one thing that he didn't do, and that made his chemical castration and threatened imprisonment completely unjust, because he didn't defend a communist spy having been blackmailed because of his homosexuality. It's in the film that he did. It's awful. But you have English people in the 1940s saying to each other that they're smart, meaning clever, which I swear to God an American would understand the word clever. It's not sort of completely alien, but there's this kind of, there's a bowing to markets. And equally you're seeing a lot of films where things just blow up and people run around a lot because they're very easy to sell to China, and China is seen as being a very large market, but you know, you might not want to read lots of subtitles. So let's just have no verbal content at all. And you'll get dreadful translations, you know, people with love in the house, but not being terribly good, sort of weaseling into print with, you know, whenever I go abroad, because I do show an interest, people give me little stacks of translations, and you almost wish that they hadn't translated the person, because you can sort of think, I think this person is a good writer, but I'm sort of viewing them through a screen. But it's, as I said, so much is to do with commercial pressure, and actually quite short-term profit. What we do about it, I mean, I have no personal control over any of this. But yeah, it's certainly out there, and the largest languages seem to be Americanized English. And the people, things there's not, you know, there are a few things more intelligent than an intelligent reading American. They're terrifyingly, you know, profoundly bright and engaged, and they're the only people who are going to be buying the translation. So you don't have to write down to them. They're the one people that you wouldn't have to write down to. But things increasingly will be translated for the benefit of the people who have no passport and don't care and would never pick up the book. It's a strange decision to make, and all we can do is continue to say it's a strange decision. I think to not be embarrassed about saying that it's a strange decision to make. Does that help? My answers are very long and also wandering.
Well, no, I mean, the thing is, I've actually improved my French a bit because I have to read Hungarian translations into French, because in English I just have to throw the book away. And it's just impossible because of that impossibility of suspension of disbelief in fiction. If you think, oh, well, they've translated this into American. So I suppose the only thing I could recommend is that people try and pick up on their second language and read the translation that isn't into English. But I mean, from the point of view of what you said about not enough people reading in translation in this country, they're not going to be encouraged, are they? So it's going to be a vicious downward spiral. That's exactly well. In every area of British literature is a vicious downward spiral. Yeah, I mean, but there's this self-fulfilling. I'm going to have that in the T-shirt. There is of the many self-fulfilling prophecies. There's a self-fulfilling prophecy that translations do not sell because people are alarmed by their strangeness, and presumably they're thinking, well, at least if we get an Americanized translation, we can sell it to Canada and America. And Australia is quite like America. They'll understand, they just don't go for an idiosyncratic British version. Which, if you think of the translations 20 years ago, I mean, for example, the translations of Frabel, that are very specific, and they made a particular cultural decision. It's quality work, but those people are not being supported. It's not. I'm sure there are people out there who still have a musical ear and who have a grasp of the appropriate languages and who could produce a translation, but nobody. I mean, they're not even paying copy editors anymore. They're certainly not going to pay for translators. Shall we shout at them? I feel we should work on the theory. If you bought a kettle and it's broken, you can take it back. I think if you buy a book and it's terribly badly translated and it's been perhaps not remotely copy edited, I think that there's sort of technically, it's not just you can't take it back. It's like I don't like it. That's subjective. But I think you could take it back if it was repetitive and poorly copy edited and very badly translated. I think all of those things you should be able to say, no, my book is broken. I want a different version that works and serves the author and serves, obviously, smaller languages like Danish. You can't sell enough books to make a living because there just aren't enough people that read Danish. So you're desperately trying to be translated, and then people are being forced to translate themselves, just to kind of ensure some kind of safety and authenticity.
I read books in translation, and I'm always pleased to see a translator's note or an explanation of what they've tried to do as a translator. Can you talk? I mean, you talked as though your translator is a second you. Have you had translators who want to preface what they've done with your work?
No. No, that particularly specifically hasn't happened.
No, so you have it sounds as though you have a very fluid relationship with your translator. I suppose these are posthumous translations, and it's a sort of cultural explanation.
I think part of why I haven't had a preface is because I'm still alive, and I also don't write period books. There almost was a case for in some cultures having an introduction today, which was set in the 1940s, to put that in a context. I mean, it didn't, as it turned out, happen, but that could have been justified.
question is that bad. People are leaving already.
No.
To move us on from the kind of ever-decreasing downward cycle of doom, I love So I Am Glad and your Cyrano de Bergerac novel, and I also love Stella Does Tricks, and I wondered if you came near to being a translator writing a screenplay and what your experience of that was like.
Oh, that's just a different circle of hell entirely. But people are prepared for that. That again puts you under particular pressures because you're almost, well, I've always felt that I was there as a representative of my people to defend their beingness in the face of, yes, but it would be more exciting if we had a car chase. Which is why it's very nice, politely put, scripts for film and television. Film in the singular is absolutely accurate. I wrote my very first screenplay in 1991, and it actually was made into a film. That has never happened since, and I've written approximately one a year. But part of the reason, apart from the fact that it's the British film industry, is that I get to a certain point and I leave because I feel that I can't defend the integrity of the story, and it's not primarily my job to work in film, so I don't do it. All that money would turn my head, turn me into a monster. But it's a very complicated medium. But again, very, very educational. People will ask you for rewrites, and sometimes it's interesting to ask why and what they mean by the rewrites. It's always interesting to ask people what they mean by the rewrites. Are you saying we should change this to an ice rink? Which is literally what happened at one point. Are you saying that because that's very interesting, or are you saying that because an ice rink is available and you think you could put this scene in an ice rink? Which it was the latter. Please tell me before you take lines, which is very interesting. Please tell me before you take lines that are being spoken by a man and put them into a woman because you're in favour of the sisterhood. Which I am not against the sisterhood, but please tell me, because if male lines are coming out of a woman's mouth when she talks to a man, she'll come across as gay as anything. Because generally speaking, women talk to women in a slightly different way, men talk to men in a slightly, we interact. It's not my fault, it's society. So those acts of sort of arbitrary translation of gender are interesting. And, commercial pressure, forcing you to try and defend your work or to make your work very watertight so that it will go in and speak for itself. Obviously, the development process for a film is kind of terrible because you're supposed to submit this thing, treatment, rather than a script, because script is a big risk. In a way, it's less of a risk because a treatment is obviously open to interpretation. And as soon as the massive group of people to whom you are giving the treatment read it, you have a massive divergence of what they think the treatment is. And they all tell you to go off and do, they think, the thing you're going to do, and you think you understand what they mean. And slowly the project can go adrift, which is both interesting and heartbreaking. But as I say, I've never really had that much of a problem with actors because actors are kind of in the same business because they're trying to work out how to be people and authentically people, and they're fastidious. But the business people, not necessarily. All you're dealing with in film, it's a document which is almost uniquely unreadable, and you have to lay it out in the way that you're supposed to lay it out. But that layout doesn't mean that you can understand it. So that's quite interesting. You're giving a very unreadable document to people who are probably not that great at reading because they're very visual and that's why they work in film, which can be frustrating. And you're looking at trying to pack meaning into the paragraphs where you describe what's happening, sometimes in ways that can be dismaying. I mean, for an example, if somebody gives you a rewrite and says this fight scene should be more exciting, And it's like, well, it doesn't exist. I don't know if it's going to be exciting or not. That's kind of not really down to me. Yeah, people will do stuff with swords. I don't know where it'll be, what it'll be, if they've got axes. I don't know. And it's dismaying to find out that you actually can solve the problem of that scene which doesn't exist and you don't know very much about not being exciting by prefacing the paragraph with, in a very exciting scene. Really all it took. So that was sad. But yeah, it's all a bit weird. But the more money is involved, the more people end up being involved, and the more high stakes it is, because it's people's livings, which you can understand, and mistakes are very big mistakes. But yeah, you know, I still believe that if something is good and true and has proper work in it and allows other people to work properly, eventually it will do well. Maybe not from the get-go. And you just have to kind of plug away, and if enough people push the world in that direction, then the downward spiral has a tiny hiccup, and everything isn't, you know, coming out of paging Dr. Goebbels.
Thank you. Given that what you've been describing seems to be kind of like a cultural decline generally, and that readers or even just people have been looking inwards and shutting off to the kind of things that translation is supposed to bring to us, sort of as a country even, do you think that it's got to the point now that simply publishing more translations wouldn't actually necessarily redress that? Whether there needs to be, it's kind of probably a chicken and the egg problem, but whether there would need to be some kind of other cultural activity that would help that kind of readership to grow again to the point where Britain would be more receptive to translations, and whether you think there would be something that would need to be done then before more translations were published, whether it would be just publishing translations better or differently in some way, or just, sort of, you know.
Yeah, I don't think it would necessarily take all that much. It would eventually have quite a large knock-on effect. I mean, you don't have to, you know, ban Nigel Farage from appearing in public and do a whole load of other complicated things about stopping the Daily Mail saying anything. You know, I'm not in favour of censorship, so for a start you couldn't do any of that. But you don't have to change the entire national mindset. Because obviously people are interested in other countries, and they will read, you know, they'll read Jo Nesbø because Jo Nesbø is sold to them not as, wow, a crazy foreign person. It's like, ooh, good crime book. It's to do with how you sell things, and there's sort of a skill base still kind of in British literature about how to sell a book. They do vaguely know how to do that. There's nothing to stop them whacking a nice jacket on a whole load of high-quality translations and making a fairly minimal investment. I mean, okay, you're paying the author and the translator, but you're not paying either of them very much. You know, they would add up to one author that you thought a little bit more of. And if you hang around for a year and a half and you publicise them well and advertise them well, guess what? You'll make your money back. You know, stick posters on railway stations. I mean, for about 20 years, myself and lots of other writers have been saying, well, you know, stop getting me on the Today programme or whatever to talk about how the short story is dead, because that's depressing and horrible. And they always phone you up and they don't say that. They say, come on and talk about the short story. And then you get there and it's like, so the short story is dead. It's like, what? Always? It's always going to be that? Come and talk about the novel. Stop it. It's not dead. Let's come and be, you know, destructive of the tiny bits of culture and light that we still have left. You know, for a very long time, we've said, you know, throw money at the short story, make it valuable. Why don't you get some big prizes that will feature short stories? And now, after 20 years of banging on about it, you've got the Folio Prize. It's possible for a short story collection last year won the Folio Prize. It's possible for a short story writer to win the Nobel Prize, which has nothing to do with us and is a very sensible prize. You've got the BBC competition and the Times competition. I mean, they're not great because they've got slightly strange eligibility and slightly strange kind of constraints upon them. I mean, you're not really going to get a winner of the BBC prize that can't be read on the BBC, so that immediately cuts the ends off the bell curve and a big chunk out of the middle of the bell curve. But there's a kind of investment in short stories, and amazingly, short stories are selling more, and people can vaguely get their heads round those things existing. You can do the same for translations. And as soon as the translations are out there, and as soon as you're used to reading lots of people, I mean, as I said, I was prepared for meeting lots of people because I'd kind of already met them. I loved being in St. Petersburg because I kind of had been in St. Petersburg a lot. It felt okay. There was Kazan Cathedral. Wow. And yet, not wow. Hello, Kazan Cathedral. I've been in you. It's that exercise of being someone other than yourself. And that can extend to, everybody's equally horrifically alien and incomprehensible, and yet not. So if you just did the very simple thing of, okay, let's have a new jacketing, let's have a little imprint in some of the, Penguin, Bertels, Gwyn, or whatever that thing now is, Random Penguin. A random penguin? I suppose they are quite random. Just every now and then, penguin. Yeah, it's random. So, they could, but I mean, it's very odd. Normally, multinational, enormous media corporations, they flex their muscles. They're evil, like Murdoch. They've got influence, and publishing is also massive multimedia. I mean, I don't know if there's still a branch. If you thread it through the connections for different businesses going back to different publishers, one of them was tied to an arms dealer for a bit. I don't know if they still are. There's money in that. They've got power, and they refuse to behave like powerful, in the way that the BBC refuses to behave like a powerful multimedia corporation on many, many occasions, all of the occasions when they might be nice and be good to humanity. Not all of the occasions, but, there's, again, the self-fulfilling prophecy that things that are about human beings having worth and things that are about art and things that are about creativity, you have to hide and you have to apologise for and you have to creep around not talking about. As soon as you start talking about them, a very large number of people really make an effort to write to you or email you or tweet you and say, yeah, I thought I was by myself. It's like, no, you're not. It would be very easy for a large, actually really quite wealthy corporation, effectively, to say, let's have a random penguin translated. Random foreign penguins. There you go. It's not the best name for a series of books. We have Random Foreign Penguin, and there you go. Publicise them a bit, they would be there. But that would begin to change the world because you're being in other people's heads. But a lot of countries, I understand them up until the 1970s, and I now no longer understand them. Or I only understand them through the news, and that's different. I only see the exciting bits of their news, which are basically about people dying or being in pain or something awful happening. And suddenly the world is full of awful things happening. And it used to be full of people having affairs and people playing the guitar and people turning into parrots and, all this wonder and usefulness. Because obviously we are, at the moment psychology, it's not very fashionable to talk about situational pressure, but obviously there is, if you're in a small, if you're in a group of people and they, for an example, if you have a piece of paper with 5 lines on it and one of the lines is shorter than the other, if you're in a group of, say, 10 other people, and the people around you, all of whom are stooges and have been told to agree that all of the lines are the same length, it's very difficult to argue. We're very easily pressured by even silly little things like not being authentic and not having integrity in how long line number 5 is. The whole of the world is like that. But the idea that you would exert that positive pressure, or just the unpredictable pressure of art, because it's harder to own, maybe, and because it's certainly not favoured by governments, because it's unpredictable and because it's strange and because it's not ideological necessarily. Ooh, nice. You know, we forget that we can push in a positive way. So yeah, I just publish them. If I had the money, I would do it. Get people who care about literature to go with it. So I mean, it wouldn't take a lot. It would just take somebody deciding. As the Yellow Jersey publications, that's 15, 20 years ago, somebody had the good idea of making very beautiful, small, unusual-looking little hardback books where writers who didn't write about sport would write about a sport. You know, it was a little niche thing that didn't exist. Everybody kind of thought, ooh, that's a bit weird. Did fantastically well because they were beautiful little books. They looked really nice. They were nice to carry around. They were nice to hold. They were nice to be around. They were well written. Nobody got all that much money for writing them. They weren't very long. And they were presented very clearly in the marketplace. That's all you would have to do.
Thank you. That was really encouraging. And even though I'm not a large, wealthy corporation.
Damn.
I think there's time for just one last question at the back. Okay.
They left.
Yes.
Thank you very much for an incredible lecture. And as a side question, I'd love to know whether the text will be available anywhere. I was really interested in your exploration in the physicality of the voice in order to do your writing justice in a way as a writer. And I wondered to what extent you're looking into the physicality of the voice in turn inflected your writing, either in terms of structure and rhythm or in terms of what you felt you could bring to your writing.
Yeah, sadly, for those of you who wanted to get the last bus home, that's a long answer. I was a theatre studies and drama student, so I did an amount of training. Retrospectively, I found that useful as a writer. We did an exercise specifically with a very good visiting teacher about looking at a single word, and you'd say this single word for hours till you truly hated it, because the word that I got was the. Can't do a lot with, really. We had to do things like make a gesture for your word. But by the end of it, you learn to respect what you were dealing with. That you don't just walk up and assume that you're going to know how to say the in the correct context of that particular situation as that person that you're trying to be in that sentence. Which was kind of lovely. And if you reverse engineered looking at your bit of Marlowe or your bit of Shakespeare and allowing it to happen to you, and obviously with bad acting you get that sort of colour wash, like when you go and see a bad King Lear. The first King Lear that I saw was Michael Gambon. And there wasn't a slip in the programme that said, don't bother again. Don't bother, unless Bill Nye agrees to do it later, you're going to have to wait till James McAvoy gets really old. The rest of the time it will be a man who starts shouting and he keeps on shouting. It'll be general angriness for hours. Nobody told me. So it's a very hard thing to do. It's very hard to do King Lear. Many people can't. And you have to have a cast that's so big and they all have to be good. And where would you get them? And you don't want to do a little part if you're really good, but you have to because you need it to be really good. And all of that. So yeah, where was I going with that? What were we talking about? Who are you? Where am I? Yeah, no. So, I was trained to think about how you would allow something to act upon you and understand it and not do a colour wash. And that was humiliating and interesting. And humiliation is interesting. And I, because I'm a Calvinist, but we don't push writers when we do a creative writing course in quite the way that actors are. I mean, you would never do, and I'm kind of pushing for this, in the way that you would do a masterclass with an actor where they would do their soliloquy and then you would actually genuinely say where it was going wrong and they would be physically... But you don't do that to writers, partly because they would literally cry. But they're going into a world that's as hard and horrible and ridiculous and unsympathetic and that owes them absolutely nothing in exactly the same way. So it would be a good preparation, and also it's informative. Once you get beyond the oh God, what? No. Once you go beyond that, it's like, well, no, it's really interesting about how bad I am being. How do I get better? By really accepting how bad I am being and burrowing in. Then I accidentally discovered. I mean, I'd taken that on sort of subconsciously maybe, but I accidentally discovered the effect that you're talking about, where something happens to your prose style, because I went to see an old school, round and round this. I'm aware that I sound the way I sound, and it's not wonderful, but it's been worse. The round and round, the ragged rocks, the ragged rascal round type of speech person, which I grew up with because I was a mumbler when I was a child, and I was sent to one of those round and round the ragged rocks people who gave me a tooth prop to make me open my mouth. It doesn't. It's like giving a child a ball gag. I mean, it's just horrible. It makes you feel very vulnerable for reasons that you can't quite understand, but you know they're bad. It's awful. I went to see this woman, and she made me unhappy because she was making me say things that had no... I don't care about ragged rascals and rocks. They can all go away. But she was interesting for two reasons. One, she gave me a piece to read, and it was some off-cut of a Russian novel. It was just a description of a passageway, I think from Crime and Punishment. One of the boring bits of Crime and Punishment, where he is walking along a passageway, about to murder someone excitingly. And it was just this Russian, corridor. And I couldn't read it interestingly, because it wasn't bloody interesting. And she said, well, what's your primary sense? Which I'd never thought of. So she was good, she was old-fashioned, but she was good. So I said, well, smell, because I didn't know that. And she said, well, what does the passageway smell of? And I could tell her, which I'd never known. I could absolutely tell you it smelled of, damp plaster, and I can still remember because it was so amazing. It was damp plaster and cabbage and uncleanness and, cold. I said, all right, now read it. And I was there. And again, you're thinking, all right, well, if I can make prose that would allow you to be there, or if when I am reading my prose, I try not so much to reproduce that experience, because then you end up, crying at the grief of your own thing. It's not about me crying, it's about you crying. I want to make you cry, it doesn't matter if I cry. But to try and think, well, how do I make that happen? How do I get the detail in? And in the process of doing that, because up to a point she'd allowed me, I was losing my voice a lot because I was doing 3, 4, 5 workshops a day with groups in strange places and dry places and odd, and being peripatetic, so you get lots of respiratory infections. So you're not great vocally for lots of different reasons. And because she made me a little bit happier, suddenly my sentences got longer. Because somewhere my body had said, well, I think actually you can say a longer sentence now. So, boff. And it happened automatically, but I noticed because I was kind of freaked out by this sense of something happening. And then every time I've done, and now I do specific work and I do repeated work, partly because I do a lot of radio and it's helpful, but partly because I know it will be interesting now. And I know it will throw things up, and I know it will unlock emotional things, and I know it will be interesting to... there's an exercise where you sing and it goes lower and lower and lower and lower and lower, and she keeps playing notes, and it's like, I've got nothing. And eventually you're just breathing out, but you're breathing out very deeply. And there's a point where I've heard somebody die. Oddly, at a reading, there were 3 of us behind a curtain, and in front of the curtain, this guy collapsed and died. So we could hear him dying. We could not see him dying. We could hear him dying. And you heard him, just go, and it's like, shit, I know that's somebody dying. And it was interesting, there was me and a doctor's son, and we were all going, oh yeah, well, and this woman's going, that means we could all die at any moment. It's like, yeah, you don't live your life on that basis. It's very sad, but, hand of doom constantly? No, well, hey. But when you're singing, you're actually hearing yourself die. You're hearing what your death rattle will be while still being alive. Gets very interesting. Partly because with the exercise you go down all the way there and then you come back up and you're not dead. But you're making a bloody live, loud noise. As particularly you would have to say women are not encouraged to. My mother doesn't do this, but I know some other people, and there's also a whole strand of French women, where women that can't say yes. Certain age of French women that they sort of go, what? Don't actually say the whole word. That's all they're going to go for. Or women who avoid saying no at all because you can't say no. They just do some other sentence because there are unsayable words. And all of that I find really fascinating. But as I say, every time, and if I'm working with people who want to be writers, I make them do things they hate because we're all antisocial and horrible. And we write things down. We don't want to be physically present when we talk to you. The last thing we want to do is wear a suit and be on a stage and blah. It's excruciating. We would rather die. The thing is that you have to work out a way of doing it because it's a good thing to do, and then you see your words. If I say something funny and you laugh, I've made you move. I couldn't make you move that much unless I hit you, and I just did it with words. That's really interesting. I mean, and obviously it's intoxicating, and public speaking to masses can be a big sort of ego trip, but it's an interesting demonstration of the power of words. And if you're feeling unhappy about them or feeling that you can't do things with them, I mean, it's a power and responsibility thing, but it's interesting to see your words being successful or to be able to place them out and to have them be enough of themselves that they can be appreciated. And I mean, certainly reading badly isn't great for anybody because you're looking at people who are in pain. Because of you, that doesn't make you want to write more. Makes you want to buy them all a drink and give them a hug. So yeah, it's all of that area is fascinating and weirdly not to be spoken of. It's frowned upon. And the essay on writing that talks about voice work. Almost at as great length as I've just gone into, but I tried to place it somewhere else, and all of the bits that were about the body were cut out. And it's like, well, no, the whole point of it was something's happening in your body, which you know and you're used to and you've grown up with and you've kind of had all around, and it gives you quite good clues about what's going on with you, and if you can be rooted, it will help you speak from a place of power. Why would that not be good? I think. So no, all of that's fascinating. Obviously not necessarily tonight, but your own experience of it could be fascinating.
Well, I think not being dead is a very good point to bring things to a close. Before we do so, could I thank very warmly the British Library for hosting us this evening. Could I invite you to continue the discussions in the bar, which will remain open now. And finally, could I thank once again very warmly our speaker this evening for a wonderful lecture, A.L. Kennedy.